The old-growth oak stood sentinel over Amelia's property, a towering, gnarled giant that had seen 300 years of sunrises and sunsets. Its branches, thick as ancient pillars, stretched wide, shading her modest craftsman home and spilling over into the manicured lawns of her meticulously ordered neighborhood. To Amelia, it wasn't just a tree. It was a living monument, a silent chronicler of the town's history, and the last tangible link to her great-great-grandmother who had planted a seedling nearby. Every leaf, every furrow in its bark, held a story. The town council had long ago designated it a historical landmark, a beacon of natural heritage in a sea of beige stucco and identical mailboxes. Her neighbor, Brenda Sterling, however, saw only an inconvenience. Brenda's home, directly across from Amelia's, was a shrine to perfection. White picket fence, rose bushes in militant formation, and a lawn so unnaturally green it seemed spray-painted. Brenda, with her razor-sharp bob, perpetually pursed lips, and an unshakable belief in the sanctity of HOA bylaws, considered the oak an affront. Its falling leaves dared to sully her immaculate sidewalks, its expansive canopy dared to cast a shadow over her prized petunias, and its sheer, untamed existence dared to challenge the sterile uniformity she enforced with the zeal of a grand inquisitor. The skirmishes had begun subtly, almost politely. A passive-aggressive note tucked into Amelia's mailbox about excessive foliage debris. Then, a pointed comment during a neighborhood potluck about preserving property values. Soon, the pleasantries dissolved into thinly veiled threats issued at HOA meetings, with Brenda, as the head of the aesthetics committee, wielding her power like a blunt instrument. Frankly, Amelia, Brenda had declared at the last meeting, her voice cutting through the polite murmur of residents, that tree is a hazard. Those roots are cracking the sidewalk, and the shade, it's detrimental to a healthy lawn. Her gaze, cold and unwavering, swept the room, daring anyone to disagree. No one did. Brenda had a way of steamrolling opposition, her arguments as unyielding as her perfectly coiffed hair. Amelia had felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Brenda, you know the oak is historically protected. It's been here since before this town was even incorporated. The roots are superficial, and I have a arborist trim them regularly. As for the shade, it's a blessing in this summer heat, and it actually helps regulate temperature, reducing energy costs for everyone. She spoke with a quiet passion, trying to appeal to logic, to history, to anything other than Brenda's obsessive need for control. Brenda merely sniffed. Rules are rules, Amelia. The bylaws state clear guidelines for landscaping. Your ancient tree is outside those guidelines. It's unsightly, and it brings down the curb appeal of the entire block. Amelia had spent the next few weeks in a state of simmering anxiety. She'd consulted her arborist again, compiled documents on the tree's protected status, and even tried to rally a few sympathetic neighbors. But Brenda's influence in the HOA was absolute. Most residents just wanted peace, even if it meant sacrificing Amelia's giant. They'd nod sympathetically, offer mumbled apologies, but no one dared challenge Brenda directly. One Tuesday morning, Amelia woke early, a restless premonition stirring in her gut. She poured coffee, the silence of the house amplified by the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in hues of rose and gold, filtering through the dense canopy of the oak outside her bedroom window. She always cherished these moments, the dappled light, the gentle rustling of leaves. Suddenly, a sound ripped through the tranquil dawn, a guttural, mechanical roar that vibrated through the very floorboards. It was the unmistakable, terrifying shriek of a chainsaw. Not a distant, neighborhood sound, but shockingly, jarringly close. Amelia's heart leaped into her throat. Her coffee cup clattered against the counter, forgotten. She sprinted to the window, her breath catching. Across the street, in Brenda Sterling's yard, a team of men in bright orange vests stood with professional-grade chainsaws, their faces grimly set. And right at the edge of Amelia's property line, encroaching onto her side, stood Brenda, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Amelia. No. No, she wouldn't, she screamed, though the sound was swallowed by the escalating whine of the machinery. She fumbled with the back door lock, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp the knob. She burst onto her lawn, barefoot, still in her pajamas, her hair a wild tangle around her face. The men paused, their chainsaws idling with a menacing growl. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, stared at Amelia with something akin to pity in his eyes. "What are you doing?" Amelia shrieked. Mrs. Henderson's words, "rare beetle protection and feds," echoed in Amelia's mind, cutting through the haze of her grief. She stared at the severed limb, then at Brenda Sterling, who was now directing the arborists with the smug satisfaction of a general overseeing a decisive victory. The chainsaw's roar had momentarily subsided, replaced by the crackling and groaning of the remaining branches as the men prepared for the next cut. "What did you say, Mrs. Henderson?" Amelia asked, her voice thin and reedy, a stark contrast to the thundering in her chest. The elderly woman wrung her hands, her eyes wide with alarm. "Oh dear, Amelia, I hope I'm not mistaken. But I distinctly recall a town hall meeting last spring, maybe early summer, about a very specific environmental protection order. Something about a rare, endangered beetle that had made its habitat in that exact tree. The federal government was involved, I think. They put up those little tags, didn't they? Those metal ones, on the lower trunk." Mrs. Henderson pointed a trembling finger at the remaining stump, now a raw, bleeding wound in the earth, where the bottom portion of the trunk still stood. Amelia's eyes darted to the stump. In the frantic chaos, she hadn't noticed. But there, barely visible beneath a layer of sawdust, was a small, tarnished metal tag, barely larger than her thumbnail, affixed with 2 tiny screws. She remembered it now, a blur of paperwork and official visits from various state and federal agencies months ago, all related to the oak's historical status and a new, unexpected layer of protection. She'd received a stack of documents, signed some forms, and then, as quickly as they'd arrived, the officials had vanished, leaving only the small, unassuming tag as evidence of their visit. She'd filed the paperwork, reassured that the oak was more protected than ever, and then the details had receded into the background of her daily life, overshadowed by Brenda's relentless campaign. Now, those details roared back with chilling clarity. A new kind of fear, colder and sharper than personal grief, pierced through Amelia. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute, or even a local historical preservation issue anymore. This was federal. Brenda, overhearing the conversation, scoffed. "Oh, for goodness sake, Mildred. Always with the dramatic. A rare beetle? You've been watching too much television. That tag is probably for a pest control treatment. Honestly, the things people invent to avoid basic property maintenance." She dismissed Mrs. Henderson with a wave of her hand, then turned to Amelia. "Now, are you going to stand there gawking all day, or are you going to move so these gentlemen can finish their work?" Amelia ignored her. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling over the screen. She needed to find that paperwork. She needed proof. But even as she frantically scrolled through old emails, a sickening thought hit her. What if Brenda knew? What if this wasn't just spite, but a calculated act of defiance against a higher authority, one that Brenda believed she could somehow circumvent with her HOA power? As if on cue, the burly arborist, who had momentarily stepped away to confer with his crew, returned to Brenda. "Ma'am, with all due respect, cutting down a tree with a federal protection tag can lead to significant legal issues. Are you absolutely certain about these permissions? We usually require written confirmation directly from the relevant federal agency for anything marked like this." His tone was cautious, a flicker of professional apprehension replacing his earlier pity. Brenda's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. Her lips tightened. "Don't be ridiculous, Gary. I told you, I have all the necessary clearances. The HOA takes precedence over any obscure federal bureaucratic nonsense. The tree is on my neighbor's property, which falls under our jurisdiction. Just finish the job. Her voice had taken on a brittle, strained edge. Gary exchanged a worried glance with one of his men. The chainsaws remained silent, their growl replaced by an uneasy quiet. They were professionals, and the mention of federal protection clearly gave them pause. Amelia, emboldened by the arborist's hesitation, stepped closer to the stump, pointing a trembling finger at the metal tag. "This isn't a pest control tag, Brenda. This is from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It signifies the presence of an endangered species habitat. I have the document. You've just committed a federal crime." Brenda's face, usually a mask of unyielding control, paled slightly. But she quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "Don't be absurd, Amelia. You're trying to intimidate my contractors. This is a local matter, a private property dispute, and I have every right to remove a nuisance from a neighboring property that violates HOA regulations." Her voice, though still authoritative, lacked its previous, unshakable. Brenda Sterling's world, so meticulously constructed of perfectly trimmed hedges and unyielding regulations, shattered around her. The color had drained from her face, leaving a sickly gray pallor. Her lips moved, forming silent, desperate pleas or questions that never materialized. The cool, confident demeanor she usually projected vanished, replaced by a raw, naked fear that Amelia had never seen in her formidable neighbor. "Ms. Sterling," Agent Davis repeated, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, "we need to ask you a few questions. This is Special Agent Miller." She gestured to the broad-shouldered man beside her, whose intense gaze seemed to take in every detail of the scene. The felled tree limbs, the anxious arborists, Amelia's tear-streaked face, and Brenda's petrified expression. Brenda finally found her voice, though it was a shaky, pathetic squeak. "Questions? What questions? This is an outrage. You can't just barge onto my property. I demand to know what this is about. This is a simple misunderstanding." She tried to regain some of her usual imperiousness, but it was a pathetic effort, like a deflating balloon. Agent Davis remained unmoved. "As I stated, Ms. Sterling, we have reports of the destruction of a federally protected wildlife habitat. The emerald ash borer beetle is an endangered species, and its known habitat in this specific oak tree was protected under federal law. Destroying that habitat carries severe penalties, including substantial fines and potential imprisonment." At the mention of imprisonment, Brenda gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. "Imprisonment? For a bug? That's preposterous. This is an HOA matter. My hydrangeas needed sunlight. The roots were a hazard." Her voice rose in a frantic, almost hysterical pitch. "With all due respect, Ms. Sterling," Agent Miller interjected, his voice deep and calm, but carrying an undeniable steeliness, "federal law supersedes HOA bylaws, especially concerning endangered species. The protections for this tree and its inhabitants were clearly marked and documented. Were you aware of these protections?" His eyes bored into Brenda's, demanding an answer. Brenda stammered, her gaze darting frantically between the two agents, then to Amelia, a flicker of desperate hatred in her eyes. I was not. Amelia never told me. She kept it a secret. She's just trying to cause trouble." Amelia stepped forward, her own fear now replaced by a cold resolve. "That's a lie, Brenda. I received all the official documents, and you were present at the town hall meeting where the federal protection was discussed. I filed copies of all the paperwork with the HOA board, which you chair, last year." Agent Davis turned her attention to Amelia, her expression softening infinitesimally. "Ma'am, are you Amelia Hayes?" "Yes," Amelia replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "And you have documentation regarding the federal protection of this oak tree and its endangered species habitat?" "Yes, I do," Amelia confirmed, already pulling up the scanned documents on her phone. "I can email them to you right now." "Excellent. We'll need those. And your statement." Agent Davis then turned back to Brenda, her face once again impassive. Ms. Sterling, the claim that you were unaware is difficult to reconcile with the facts presented by Ms. Hayes and the obvious federal marker still visible on the tree's stump. Furthermore, your arborist raised concerns about the tag before proceeding. The burly arborist, Gary, stepped forward hesitantly. That's right, ma'am. I told Ms. Sterling we needed written federal confirmation. She insisted she had it and that the HOA authorized everything. Brenda's face crumpled. He misunderstood. I just meant the HOA paperwork. Not federal. This is a witch hunt. All because of that tree. She gestured wildly at the ruined oak. Agent Miller pulled out a small notepad and pen. Ms. Sterling, we need to ask you to step away from the worksite. The tree, or what's left of it, is now evidence. And we need to secure this area. You also have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. The familiar words, ripped from countless TV shows, hit Brenda with the force of a physical blow. Her shoulders sagged. The pretense of control, of indignant outrage, completely vanished. She looked small, defeated, and utterly terrified. Amelia watched the scene unfold, a strange mixture of sorrow and grim satisfaction churning within her. The magnificent oak was gone, its centuries of life brutally extinguished. Nothing could bring it back. But the woman who had so ruthlessly ordered its destruction, who had wielded her petty power with such callous disregard, was finally facing consequences that far transcended th. The black SUV, a silent predator, whisked Brenda Sterling away from the meticulously manicured cul-de-sac she had so desperately sought to control. She sat stiffly in the back, the plush leather offering no comfort, the silence punctuated only by the low hum of the engine. Agent Davis, impassive, drove, while Agent Miller sat beside Brenda, his notepad still open, his gaze occasionally flickering to her in the rearview mirror. Brenda's mind was a frantic kaleidoscope of accusations, denials, and a chilling realization of the abyss she had stepped into. A bug? Imprisonment? This was insane. At the federal building, the initial processing was a blur of fluorescent lights, official forms, and the dehumanizing click of a camera. Her designer handbag was emptied, its contents catalogued. The diamond engagement ring her late husband had given her felt heavy, mocking her in its opulence amidst the stark reality of her situation. She was offered a phone call, and with trembling fingers, she dialed the number of the high-powered corporate lawyer who usually handled her husband's estate matters. This was hardly a simple probate issue. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice cracking, "it's Brenda Sterling. I need your help. The FBI just arrested me. Over a tree. And a beetle." The absurdity of it all, juxtaposed with the grim reality of her predicament, threatened to push her over the edge. Thorne, a man whose calm under pressure was legendary, listened patiently, his occasional or "I see," the only indication of his processing the surreal information. Meanwhile, back on Elmwood Drive, the scene was still buzzing with activity. Federal agents, now clearly identifiable by their discrete badges, meticulously documented every fragment of the felled oak. Forensics teams in white suits examined the sawed surfaces, taking samples, their movements clinical and precise. They were looking for evidence of the emerald ash borer, a creature whose microscopic life now carried the weight of federal law. Amelia, after giving her statement to Agent Davis and providing digital copies of all her documentation, felt a profound emptiness settle over her. The anger, the fear, the adrenaline, it had all drained away, leaving behind a cold ache of loss. The majestic canopy that had once sheltered her home was gone, replaced by an unforgiving expanse of open sky. The sunlight, once dappled and gentle, now beat down with a harsh, unyielding glare. Mrs. Henderson offered her a hug, her eyes moist. "It's a terrible thing, Amelia. But you did the right thing. Justice, well, it finds its way eventually. Other neighbors, previously silent and complicit in Brenda's reign of terror, now ventured out, their faces a mix of shock, curiosity, and a nascent sense of liberation. Whispers rippled through the cul-de-sac. "Can you believe it? The FBI. For the tree, imagine. I always knew she was trouble, but federal trouble?" The power Brenda had wielded, built on fear and social pressure, was dissipating like smoke. Suddenly, there were more sympathetic glances towards Amelia, more nods of solidarity. A few even offered quiet apologies for not standing up to Brenda sooner. Later that evening, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room of Thorne's law firm, Brenda Sterling sat across from her formidable lawyer. Thorne, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, steepled his fingers, his expression grave. "Brenda," he began, his voice measured, "this isn't good. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, under the Endangered Species Act, doesn't mess around. And the fact that you dismissed the warnings from the arborist, and that Amelia has documented proof of the federal designation, that hurts us significantly." Brenda bristled, a flicker of her old defiance returning. "But it's my property." "Well, Amelia's, but it was encroaching on mine. And the HOA. The HOA is irrelevant, Brenda," Thorne cut in, his voice firm. "Federal law supersedes local ordinances in this context. And your position as HOA chair, having received and likely ignored the documentation, will only make it worse. The prosecution will argue you acted with malicious intent and a clear disregard for the law." "Malicious intent?" Brenda scoffed. "I just wanted a nice, clean property. That tree was a mess." Thorne sighed, running a hand over his perfectly sculpted hair. "We need to mitigate the damage. The best defense, in this case, might be to claim ignorance, despite the evidence. We'll argue you genuinely believed the HOA had the authority, and that Amelia deliberately withheld information or confused you. It's a long shot, but we have to try." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Tell me everything about Amelia Hayes. Her habits, her associations, any grudges she might hold. Anything that could cast doubt on her credibility." Brenda's fear slowly morphed into a rekindled fury. Her mind, ever tactical, began to churn. Amelia trying to cause trouble. That wasn't just a desperate. The following days were a whirlwind for Amelia, a strange blend of quiet grief for her fallen giant and the unsettling hum of federal presence. Agents Davis and Miller were frequent, if discreet, visitors, their questions probing deeper into the history of the tree, the HOA, and, increasingly, Brenda Sterling's character. Amelia answered patiently, detailing Brenda's obsessive nature, her rigid adherence to bylaws, and the relentless campaign she had waged against the oak. She found solace in the thoroughness of their investigation, a sense that justice, though slow, was methodical. What she didn't realize was that Brenda Sterling and her formidable lawyer, Mr. Thorne, were not idly waiting for the hammer to fall. Thorne, a master of legal maneuvering, had wasted no time in crafting a counter-narrative, one designed to chip away at Amelia's credibility and paint Brenda as an unwitting victim of bureaucratic overreach and a vindictive neighbor. A week after the felling, Amelia received an official-looking letter in her mailbox. It wasn't from the FBI or the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was from Thorne Associates, a cease and desist order alleging defamation and unjustified harassment against Brenda Sterling. The letter further claimed that Amelia had deliberately withheld crucial information regarding the tree's federal protection, thus entrapping Brenda into an unintentional violation. It was a brazen, audacious lie designed to muddy the waters and shift blame. Amelia stared at the letter, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a renewed surge of disbelief and anger. She was blaming me? The audacity of it was staggering. She immediately called her own, much more modest, lawyer, a kind woman named Sarah who specialized in local property law. Sarah, after listening to Amelia's incredulous recounting, advised her to ignore the cease and desist for now, calling it a fishing expedition from Thorn, but warned her that Brenda was clearly preparing for a protracted legal battle. The first ripple effect hit the HOA. An emergency meeting was called, not to address the federal investigation, but at Brenda's legal team's insistence, to discuss misinformation and malicious gossip spreading within the community. Thorn himself attended, a silver-tongued serpent among a flock of bewildered sheep. He spun a narrative of Brenda, a dedicated community leader, being unfairly targeted by a neighbor with a known history of emotional attachment to Flora, who had failed to adequately communicate critical information. He even subtly alluded to Amelia's single status and her somewhat reclusive nature, painting her as an outsider with a grudge. The immediate reaction was mixed. Some neighbors, relieved to see Brenda gone, whispered their dissent. Others, easily swayed by Thorn's authoritative presence and the implied threat of legal action, began to look at Amelia with new suspicion. The tentative solidarity Amelia had felt after Brenda's arrest began to fray. Then came the FBI follow-up. Agent Miller arrived at Amelia's door one afternoon, his expression still calm, but a subtle shift in his demeanor was evident. "Ms. Hayes," he began, "we need to follow up on a few points. Ms. Sterling's counsel is suggesting that you, and not Ms. Sterling, were primarily responsible for communicating the federal protection status to all relevant parties, including the HOA board, and that you may have intentionally failed to ensure Ms. Sterling understood the implications." Amelia felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "That's absurd. I provided all the documentation to the HOA. Brenda herself chairs the Aesthetics Committee. She received copies of everything, and she was at the town hall meeting." Agent Miller nodded slowly. "We understand your position, Ms. Hayes. However, Ms. Sterling's defense is arguing that while documents may have been filed, you never personally and unequivocally ensured her understanding, given her stated difficulties with complex legal jargon." He paused, his gaze sharp. "They are suggesting you exploited her perceived lack of understanding to create this situation." "Exploited her?" Amelia's voice rose in disbelief. "She's a master manipulator. She understood perfectly well. She just chose to ignore it because it didn't fit her agenda. She wanted that tree gone." "We're simply following up on all claims, Ms. Hayes," Miller said, his tone neutral. "It's standard procedure. We have to investigate all angles." The conversation continued for another hour, Amelia trying to rebut every insidious claim, every twisted interpretation Brenda's lawyer had concocted. When Miller finally left, a lingering sense of unease settled over Amelia. She had expected to be a witness, a victim. She had not expected to be subtly implicated, to have her character questioned, and her motives scrutinized. That evening, as Amelia sat in her living room, staring out at the empty space where the oak had stood, Carol Jenkins's words hung in the air, a poisonous miasma on Amelia's porch. The accusation, flung with such self-righteous conviction, ignited a fire within Amelia that had been smoldering beneath layers of grief and shock. "Carol," Amelia said, her voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the tremor in her hands. "That is a blatant lie." Brenda was fully aware of the tree's protected status. "I have documents, and the entire HOA board, including Brenda, received copies." Carol scoffed, shaking her head. "That's not what Brenda says. She says you're jealous, Amelia. Jealous of her position, her house, everything. And now you're trying to ruin her over a stupid tree." With a final, disdainful glare, Carol turned and marched back across the street, leaving Amelia standing in the chilling silence, the echoes of the accusation reverberating in her ears. The next morning, Amelia walked into Sarah's office, the cease and desist letter clutched in her hand. Sarah, her expression grim, listened intently to Amelia's account of Carol's doorstep attack and the FBI's follow-up questions. "This is exactly what Thorn is trying to do," Sarah explained, tapping a pen against her legal pad. He's creating a he said, she said scenario, hoping to cast enough doubt on your testimony to weaken the federal case against Brenda. He wants to make this about a petty neighborhood dispute, not an environmental crime. But it's not true, Amelia exclaimed, her frustration bubbling over. I have proof. The town meeting minutes, the emails, the HOA documentation. And that's what we're going to use, Sarah affirmed, a steely resolve in her eyes. We can't just ignore this. We need to proactively counter Brenda's narrative. We'll start by compiling every single piece of communication you ever had with the HOA, with Brenda, with the town council regarding that tree. Every email, every letter, every time-stamped document. And we need to find witnesses. Over the next few days, Amelia transformed from a grieving homeowner into a meticulous investigator. She delved into old filing cabinets, resurrected forgotten email threads, and even dug out photographs of the tree with the federal tag clearly visible on its trunk from a summer picnic last year. The sheer volume of evidence supporting her claims was overwhelming. More importantly, she started talking to her neighbors, not just the initially sympathetic Mrs. Henderson, but others who had long harbored quiet resentments against Brenda's iron-fisted rule. Mr. Rodriguez, whose pristine front yard had once been cited for a single rogue dandelion, offered Amelia a copy of his meticulously kept records of HOA fines, many of which had been Brenda's doing. A young couple, new to the neighborhood, admitted Brenda had aggressively rejected their plans for a backyard garden shed, claiming it didn't fit the aesthetic vision. They were scared of Brenda, but Amelia's newfound determination resonated with their own suppressed frustrations. They weren't willing to testify publicly yet, but their quiet support was a powerful affirmation. Amelia even reached out to the local historical society, explaining the situation. They were outraged by the destruction of the landmark oak and immediately offered to provide their own documentation of the tree's protected status and its significance to the town's history, further bolstering Amelia's case. Meanwhile, agents Davis and Miller continued their federal investigation. They too were finding inconsistencies in Brenda's story. The arborist, Gary, had provided his detailed account of Brenda's insistence despite his warnings. The local fish and wildlife representative confirmed that ample public and private notifications had been issued. While Thorne's defense was aggressive, the FBI was thorough, and Amelia's organized evidence only served to solidify their case. One afternoon, Agent Davis called Amelia. Ms. Hayes, we've reviewed the documents you provided. They're very comprehensive. Ms. Sterling's claim of ignorance is becoming increasingly untenable. However, her counsel is now alleging that while documents were present, the method of communication was insufficient. Essentially, that you hid behind paperwork, knowing Brenda wouldn't read it. Amelia sighed, a weary but determined sound. She reads everything, Agent. Especially if it gives her an excuse to dictate to someone else. Understood, Davis replied. We're building our case. Just be prepared for more pressure from Ms. Sterling's side. She's not going down quietly. Agent Davis's warning proved prophetic. The HOA board, under the continued, albeit increasingly desperate, influence of Brenda and Thorne, scheduled another emergency meeting. This time, it wasn't just about misinformation. It was explicitly to discuss the ongoing negative impact of resident Amelia Hayes's conduct on community harmony and property values. Amelia, accompanied by Sarah, walked into the community center.